All right, guys. It's going to be a difficult one today. That was brought to my attention in the comment section that I was reminded of a viral Twitter post from a few years back. Completely destroys the pro-life argument. It just eviscerates it. We're all going to have to become baby killers now. There's no choice. Hang on one second. I got to turn my wife's mic on. We're all going to have to become baby killers now. We're not going to have a choice. Our entire worldview has now been shattered using facts and logic. So, what does this mean for us? And is the ethical question that they ask enough to entirely destroy the pro-life argument? So, let's talk about it. Okay, so this particular post, it's from a few years back. Yeah, 2017. Okay. But every time abortion gets brought up, it's like it returns. So we're gonna have to address it. And brace yourselves. You may have to become baby killers. It may be that your worldview is so fragile that this ethical conundrum entirely destroys it. So, man's viral pro-choice question shuts down the anti-abortion argument. He says he hasn't had a straightforward answer in 10 years. So, Twitter thread that undermines the core argument against abortion has gone viral, causing a stir on both sides of the debate. Science fiction author and journalist Patrick Tomlinson challenged one of the central notions used by pro-lifers, that life begins at conception, and therefore a human embryo holds the same value as a human child. Speaking to his 25,000 followers, Tomlinson said that, okay, so we're going to look at the actual post here. Somebody threw this into the comments in my last video about the Kansas and abortion, and every time it's brought up like a, but you never thought of that one. Like, this post keeps returning all the time, and it's fairly easy to answer, I think, from our worldview. So, Patrick Tomlinson, but interestingly, we'll address, it does point out a few very interesting things about the humanist worldview. The fact that they think this is a good argument tells us something about a view based completely out of humanism, and it's really interesting. So, whenever abortion, so here's the actual original post. You can read along, or I'll read it too. Whenever abortion comes up, turn that down a tiny bit. Whenever abortion comes up, I have a question I've been asking for 10 years of the life begins at conception crowd. That's his quotes, not mine. In 10 years, no one has ever answered it honestly. So our goal today, if anything, is to answer honestly. Even if it completely destroys our worldview, we're going to try. We're going to try and answer it honestly. It's a simple scenario, 2 outcomes. No one ever wants to pick one because the correct answer destroys their argument. And there is a correct answer, which is why the pro-life crowd hates the question. Here it is. You're in a fertility clinic. Why isn't it important? This is, if you're trying to construct an argument, and you have to create really, really refined parameters right from the onset, at which you can't question, you're off to a bad start. This is basic understanding, like of logic. If you're constructing a scenario which someone can't ask questions about said scenario, there's something wrong with your premise to begin with. But we'll continue on. Let's continue on. You're in a fertility clinic. Why isn't it important? The fire alarm goes off. You run for the exit. As you run down the hallway, you hear a child screaming from behind a door. You throw open the door and find a 5-year-old crying for help. You're in one corner of the room. In the other corner, you spot a frozen container labeled 1,000 viable human embryos. The smoke is rising. You start to choke. You can grab one or the other, but not both. Before you succumb to smoke inhalation and die, saving no one. So you have option A, save the child, the 5-year-old child. Option B, save the 1,000 embryos. There is no C. C means you all die. In a decade of arguing with the anti-abortion people about the definition of human life, I've never gotten a single straight A or B answer to this question, and I never will. Never. He never has. Okay, here we go. What's the right answer? Is A or B? The answer is A. Save the 5-year-old. Yeah, this one to me is fairly easy, and it actually doesn't undermine our concept of like life having value actually at all. So a couple things first that we got to address, like housekeeping on this question. The statement that there's a frozen container labeled 1,000 viable human embryos. One, they need to define what they mean in this case by viable, because viable is a term that only the pro like abortion people use to begin with. Like they generally means like their statement is that like outside the womb, as a conservative right, and particularly Christian right, life begins at conception. And so this whole concept of like viable, this is your term. So define what it means to me, because a jar, like the sheer like extent of sci-fi-ness you have to go into to construct this ethical question is deeply bizarre, right? A frozen jar of viable embryos. But as far as I know, the concept that you've used, not me, you've used when you say viable is able to live outside the womb. A frozen jar of embryos obviously can't do that. And again, viable is your term. This is not mine. I'm not determining the value of human life based on viability. This is not my term. So if you're going to convince me that I'm supposed to care about this vial, or this jar of embryos, you need to explain first what you mean by viability, because clearly in this case, you're not meaning what you've always meant, which is able to live outside the womb. Which the reason we disagree even with that is because a baby is designed to grow in the womb. The teleological reality of having sex is that a child is then conceived and it begins to grow within the womb. This is like the entire understanding of where that child is supposed to be at that particular time. This is the reality of where it's supposed to be. So this concept of like viability as if there's some other place that it's supposed to be at like 26 weeks. No, it's exactly where it's supposed to be, as like very, very intentionally. It's supposed to be in that place, being cared for by that person. So the concept of viability, that's your term, not ours. So even the very beginning, the concept 1,000 viable human embryos, it violates what they mean by viable, and we're not the ones that use that term anyways. So already off to a really bad start in this bizarre, hypothetical, incredibly sterile scenario. But okay, so the question of, so there are, I think when we look at this question, 3 main logic fallacies here. There is a straw man with the assumption that, well, I'll list the logic fallacies and we'll go into them. There's 3 main logic fallacies here. There's going to be a straw man fallacy, there's a major false equivalency, and then there is a false dichotomy. So when they are saying, the straw man, I believe here, is they're constructing this notion from a humanist view that your objection to abortion is this humanist view that you're ending a massive bio life. And that's why they're trying to equate like a frozen jar of embryos over in a corner. What the pro-life position is we can define maybe much better than that. And optically, I get it. For a long period of time, especially boomers, they're on this whole thing of like wanting to phrase things nicely. So they said pro-life. Maybe we just should have said, hey, like we're against like infanticide. I'm fine with that. We're against like murdering babies. We are like anti infanticide. That could have been the position. So what we're opposed to very specifically is what pro-life, what our position is that you don't have license or authority to go and murder a child of which you've conceived and is now growing inside of you. You don't have the authority to go and kill it. So making this like equivalence of, well, what about this? So that's our position. Our position is you don't have license or authority to kill an innocent child that's now growing within inside of you. And the counter's like, well, what about if you're in like a laboratory and there's a 5-year-old, and then over in the other corner there's a jar of human tissue that is embryos that are they're viable. They're viable how? They're viable how? Once you bring in another person, like what, a doctor, probably a whole like whole posse of doctors together to put it inside of yet like another person. What does this have to do with our argument? This is the same like straw man when they talk about ectopic pregnancies or molar pregnancies. They're like, yeah, well, they're not going to let you. What about like a molar pregnancy? And that's going to, it's going to, and like, yeah, listen, what we're opposed to is you taking a life that's growing within the uterus and killing it. Like, that's what we're opposed to. This is why ectopic pregnancies is a non-issue and molar pregnancies is a non-issue. And even in the most far right of places, even when they do the most draconian of child-saving measures, molar pregnancies and like ectopic stuff isn't counted. So back to this question, or back to the logic issues we have. So straw man, where they're assuming that to be pro-life is just because you're pro like biomass. Like, no, we're pro a human being that has a soul that's growing inside of a uterus, because eventually that's going to be a child, and it is at that point. But eventually it's going to be a child outside of said uterus and in this earth, and has a soul and has intrinsic value that is limitless. It's an infinite amount of value of it being an actual human being. And that value is at any point of said human being's life. It has a baseline value that is limitless. So it makes a straw man assumption that what you're just opposed to is death of biomass, because it's calling a frozen jar of what they're calling human embryos, that they're calling viable human embryos in a freezer. And our assumption is that we're against somebody killing a child that's growing inside of them, where that child is supposed to be at that time. At 26 weeks, is not supposed to be anywhere else. And it actually would be the extension of this argument. Another place we would find it is if, let's say, culturally it became the norm that every single parent chose to have their child adopted. If that became the norm, that every single person was going to have their child adopted, I would have the exact same objection, because the child is supposed to be cared for by you. It's the exact same reason I have an objection to like a Hillary Clinton statement of like, it takes a village. You have parents. Parents are ordained to care for their children. And the discussion. So the next logic fallacy, the false equivalency, when it's trying to make like this, we can even harken back to what I just said, is trying to make some equivalency against like a frozen jar in a laboratory. Like the frozen. So how do they get there? Where are these embryos? I'll call them. See, again, this is such a weird question. Where are their parents? How did they get into this jar? Why is this jar in the freezer in a corner? Who are they going to go into? Who is the parents that are like growing this life? It's trying to equate a bunch of like a laboratory experiment in a freezer somewhere with like growing life inside of a womb. It's not a 1-to-1 ratio. This really isn't even a fit. So I think so. False equivalency, and the big one is false dichotomy. The dichotomy is that if you have two choices, and if you choose to save the one child, you've determined that the embryos have no value, and by extension, embryos growing or fetus stage of a human development growing within a womb has no value. This is a terrible false dichotomy, and we can kill this one really fast. This one, terrible phrasing there, but we can end this one really, really easily. Okay, so let's take same room, same scenario. One corner is a 5-year-old kid, and the other corner is two 83-year-olds that are on life support. What do you do? Take the 5-year-old kid. Same for the exact same reasons. Let's say in one corner is a 16-year-old boy, man, and in the other is an 18-year-old girl. However, that's 25 weeks pregnant. You save the girl. That's 2 lives. Let's make it really interesting here. Let's say one corner. Let's make it where the application of what our actual mandate is in regards to like children. Let's say one corner is my children and the other is like 4 of a stranger's. Who do you think's gonna be saved? Yeah, it's gonna be my kid. It's gonna be my kid. It's getting out of that burning building. And so nobody from the, well, that's because you want to extend your biology crowd chimes in. Let's say one corner is my wife and the other corner is both of your parents and your entire extended family. You want to guess who's getting out of the building? I mean, that's an easy one. Obviously, my wife, the one that I'm one flesh with, is getting out of that building. Now, here's a question. Did any of the people that I chose to not get out of that building have no value? Right? That's a really, really obvious answer to that one. Obviously, they all had value. Every single person in this equation had value. You know why? Here's where it's good. Here's what's good. Because I don't determine the value of a human life. Neither do you. Neither does anybody else. This is all external. This is all from a creator. We are all uniquely designed and have souls and have a specific baseline value. Whether I were to choose to save one over the other. And then on top of that, each of us are given unique and specific mandates and circles of authority. So in this particular case, if someone from within my specific circle of authority were in the room, my obligation would be to save them first. So in this case, it would be my children. It would be my children over, almost any conceivable number on the other side. My children are getting out of that building first, as would my wife. And the reality here is that if a person chose, let's change the scenario a little bit and say there's 1,000 people on one side of the room and the 5-year-old kid on the other side of the room. In either case, you're talking about people of limitless value, right? They have infinite value, and so even like there's no way you can scientifically answer this question because they both have an infinite amount of value, and so you wouldn't be morally wrong in taking out either. It's just true. Unless one of them was in a circle of authority of which you've been delegated, then you have an obligation to save that particular person. But otherwise, the reason that mankind has value is given to us from an external source, and we don't get to really determine that. So in this particular case, in your particular bizarre scenario, I don't know how we equate a jar in a frozen laboratory with like life growing in a womb. Because one, again, teleological, the life's supposed to be growing in the womb. That's where it's supposed to be specifically at that point. So this to me, enormous like false equivalency. I think there's a huge straw man here and the assumption that if you aren't for this like bio life within a laboratory, well then that means you don't really believe that life begins at conception. And then the big one, the main one, is just this false dichotomy that if for some reason you ascribed more value to the 5-year-old, means that you're assuming the other has no value. And we saw that one resolved really easy. Obviously, your parents will have value, but guess what? Mine are getting out of that building first. Your children, your family has incredible value, has infinite value, but mine's getting out of that building first. So this setup of this question, I don't feel really like it's just... It creates this really bizarre like juxtaposition that is supposed to mean that in the end, well, it means that you don't actually think embryos have value. And like, no, you would need to come up with the equivalent of like a life growing within a uterus of a woman for it to be even a fair like question anyways. And I've already answered that. If you have a 18-year-old woman with or 19, 20-year-old woman, pick whatever age, and they've got life growing inside of them, that's the one you're getting out of the building because there's 2 lives. So this is easy. But I think to close it out, I would like to throw a potential, like, actual difficult ethical question. Since we're into trying to come up with, like, bizarre abstract juxtapositions, I'll leave you with one that I think is actually difficult. So, same building, same term, same scenario, except this time there's 2 5-year-olds. However, one of them is Kyle Rittenhouse. The other is Scott Roeder. You have to decide. Work it out in the comments. Cheers.